The carriage wheels had barely stopped turning when Margaret Hart grabbed her niece by the wrist and pulled her through the side door of the house, away from the eyes of the arriving guests. "Not one word," Margaret hissed. "Not one glance out that window. Do you understand me, Eliza?" Eliza tried to pull her arm free, but her aunt's grip was iron. "I only wanted to see the carriages. I have never seen so many in one place." "You will see nothing. You will be seen by no one. Tonight and every night this month you do not exist in this house." The words landed like a slap. Eliza stood frozen in the narrow hallway, the smell of beeswax candles and fresh flowers drifting in from the front rooms, the sound of laughter and violins tuning somewhere beyond the walls. Just an hour ago, she had been helping the kitchen staff carry trays of pastries, humming along with the excitement building through the house. Now her aunt was staring at her as though she were a stain that needed to be scrubbed out before company arrived. "Why?" Eliza asked. "What have I done?" Margaret's face was pale, her eyes darting toward the drawing room where her daughter Charlotte was already greeting the first guests. "You have done nothing. That is exactly the problem. You are nothing to these people, and it must stay that way. If the Duke of Wardour so much as learns your name tonight, everything I have built for Charlotte will crumble." Eliza did not understand the sentence, not fully, but she understood the fear behind it. She had heard whispers her whole life, about her mother, about a debt owed to their family, about papers locked away in a room she was forbidden to enter. She had always assumed the whispers were nothing more than servants' gossip. Now, watching her aunt's hands tremble as she straightened her own gown, Eliza began to wonder if there was something true buried beneath them. "Go to the attic," Margaret said. "Take a candle, take your sewing, and do not come down until I send for you. If anyone asks about a second girl in this house, you tell them nothing. You are a cousin's daughter visiting, unwell, resting. Do you hear me?" "I hear you," Eliza said quietly. Margaret studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether the girl in front of her could be trusted with silence. Then she turned and walked briskly toward the sound of the violins, smoothing her skirts, transforming in 3 steps from a frightened woman into a gracious hostess. Eliza climbed the narrow back stairs alone, the sounds of the party growing fainter with every step. By the time she reached the attic, the music was only a soft hum beneath the floorboards, like something happening in another world entirely. The attic room was small and cold, with a single round window that looked out over the front drive. Eliza set her candle on the wooden table and, against every instruction she had just been given, crossed to the window and looked down. Carriage after carriage rolled up the gravel path, releasing men in fine coats and women in gowns that shimmered even in the moonlight. Eliza had never seen anything like it. She pressed her palm to the cold glass and watched as footmen rushed to open doors, as laughter rose up from the crowd gathering on the front steps. Then a carriage arrived that was different from the rest. It bore no elaborate crest, no gold trim, nothing to announce its owner. Yet the moment its door opened, every other conversation on the drive seemed to pause. A tall man stepped down, dressed simply but with unmistakable authority in the way he moved. Even from this distance, Eliza could see the crowd shift toward him, like iron filings pulled by a magnet. She did not need anyone to tell her who he was. The Duke of Wardour had arrived. Eliza had heard the name spoken in her aunt's house for weeks, always in tones of hope and calculation. The Duke was young, unmarried, and, according to every rumor that traveled through the servants' quarters, searching for a wife before the year's end. Every family with an unmarried daughter within 100 miles had been preparing for this ball as though it were a battle to be won. Watching him now, Eliza felt something she had not expected. Not admiration, not envy of the women rushing to greet him. Curiosity. He walked through the crowd with a kind of quiet reserve, nodding politely but never lingering, his eyes moving over the gathered guests as though searching for something or someone who was not among them. A soft knock startled her from the window. She turned to find the young housemaid, Grace, slipping into the attic with a plate of bread and cheese balanced in one hand. "Your aunt sent me," Grace whispered, setting the plate down. "She says you're to eat up here and not make a sound. The whole house has ears tonight, she says, with all those guests wandering the halls. Thank you, Grace. Eliza took the plate gratefully. Is it very grand down there? Grace's eyes lit up. Grander than anything I've ever seen. Miss Charlotte looks like a queen in her blue gown, though she keeps fussing at the seams. And the food, Eliza towers of it, more than this whole house could eat in a month. And the Duke, have you seen him up close? Grace lowered her voice further, glancing toward the door as if the walls themselves might report her. I carried a tray past him not 10 minutes ago. He thanked me. Actually thanked me like I was a person and not a piece of furniture. The other guests barely look at us servants at all. She hesitated, then added, he has a serious face, like he's thinking of something far away, even while he's smiling at the ladies in front of him. Eliza smiled despite herself. That sounds like a very tiring way to attend a party. I imagine it's tiring to be a duke, Grace said. Everyone wanting something from you every hour of every day. She glanced at the door again. I have to go before I'm missed. Eat your supper and try to sleep. Your aunt will send for you when the guests are gone. After Grace left, Eliza sat by the window for a long while, picking at the bread without much appetite. Her mind kept circling back to her aunt's fear, the sharp, sudden panic that had gripped Margaret the moment the first carriage appeared. It was not simply the fear of an awkward introduction or a poorly timed remark. It was deeper than that, older than that. Eliza thought of the locked room at the end of the east hallway, the one door in the entire house she had never once seen open. She thought of the trunk her mother had left behind, the one Margaret had taken and never mentioned again after the funeral. She thought of the strange formality with which her aunt sometimes referred to her, not as my niece, but as your mother's daughter, as though the connection to Eliza's own mother mattered more than any bond to Eliza herself. Whatever secret lay behind her aunt's fear, it had a shape. It had a name, even if Eliza did not yet know it. And for the first time in her quiet, sheltered life, she found herself needing to understand what that name might be. Below, the music swelled into something faster, more joyful, the sound of dancing feet vibrating faintly through the old floorboards. Eliza pressed her forehead to the cool glass of the window and watched the lights of the ballroom spill out across the lawn, gold and warm against the dark grass. She thought of Charlotte, dancing somewhere in that golden light, laughing with the confidence of a girl who had never once been told to hide. She thought of her aunt, moving through the crowd with practiced grace, guarding her secrets as carefully as she guarded her daughter's future. And she thought of the Duke, walking among strangers with that distant, searching look in his eyes, as if he too were looking for something the world had hidden from him. A gust of wind rattled the attic window, and Eliza pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The candle on the table had burned low, its flame flickering with every draft that slipped through the old frame. She should sleep, she knew. There would be more days like this one, more nights of hiding while the house below her filled with people who did not know she existed. Her aunt had made that much clear. But sleep would not come easily. Not with the music still drifting up through the floor, not with the memory of that tall figure stepping down from his carriage, his eyes searching the crowd for something he could not seem to find. Eliza did not know, as she finally blew out the candle and lay down on the narrow attic bed, that somewhere below her, in a ballroom bright with candlelight, a conversation was taking place that would change the course of her quiet, hidden life forever. She did not know that her name, the name her aunt had forbidden anyone to speak, had already been mentioned once that evening, in a hallway just outside the ballroom, by a servant who did not realize how carefully that name was meant to be buried. All she knew, as the last candle flame died and the darkness of the attic settled around her, was that something in the house had shifted tonight. The careful, quiet order her aunt had built over so many years had cracked, just slightly at the edges. And though Eliza could not yet see through that crack to what lay beyond it, she could feel it, a change in the air. A change she did not yet have words for, but one she would remember for the rest of her life as the night everything began. Outside, the last carriages continued to arrive, their lamps glowing like small stars against the darkness, carrying guests toward a ballroom where secrets and hopes moved as freely as the dancers themselves. And in that ballroom, a duke stood near the edge of the crowd, only half listening to the conversation around him, his attention drawn again and again to a narrow attic window high above the party, where a single candle had just gone dark. He did not know why the small, distant light had caught his eye. He only knew that something about it had. The night was far from over, and the true story of Eliza Hart, hidden away, unheard of, unseen, was only just beginning to unfold. Aunt Margaret returned to the ballroom with her chin lifted and her smile fixed firmly in place, but her mind was not on the music or the guests circling the room. It was on the attic, 3 floors above, where she had left her niece with strict instructions to remain invisible. She told herself the arrangement was temporary, only for tonight, only until the Duke of Wardour had made his choice and moved on to whichever family he favored. Once his attention settled elsewhere, Eliza could return to her ordinary place in the household, quiet and unremarkable, exactly as she had always been. But Margaret knew, deep in the part of herself she rarely allowed to speak, that the danger was not so easily contained. It was not simply that Eliza might catch the Duke's eye with her looks or her manners. It was that Eliza carried a name, a lineage, a connection that Margaret had spent years trying to erase from memory. If that connection ever surfaced, if anyone in this glittering room learned the truth about who Eliza's mother had been and what she had once meant to the Wardour family, everything Margaret had built for Charlotte would collapse in an instant. She found her daughter near the refreshment table, surrounded by 3 other young women, all of them fanning themselves and laughing at some remark Margaret had not heard. Charlotte looked radiant in her blue gown, her cheeks flushed with excitement, her eyes bright with the particular joy of a girl who believed the whole evening had been arranged for her benefit. "Mother," Charlotte said, catching sight of her, "have you seen him yet, the Duke? He is taller than I imagined, and he has the most serious expression, as though he is always thinking of something important." "I have seen him," Margaret said, keeping her voice light. "A fine figure of a man and precisely the sort of match this family needs. Have you spoken with him?" Charlotte's excitement dimmed slightly. "Not yet. He has barely spoken to anyone. He greets people, he is polite, but he does not linger. I began to wonder if he finds the whole evening tiresome." "Dukes are permitted to find things tiresome," Margaret said. "It is one of the privileges of the title. Your task is simply to be the one thing in the room he does not find tiresome at all." One of Charlotte's friends, a sharp-eyed girl named Beatrice, leaned in with a mischievous smile. "I heard he refused 3 introductions already this evening. Lady Fenwick was quite put out." "Then Lady Fenwick's daughter did not present herself well," Margaret said briskly. "Charlotte, come. Let us find a moment when he is not surrounded, and I will see that you are properly introduced." As Margaret led her daughter across the ballroom floor, weaving between clusters of guests, her eyes swept the room with the same watchfulness she had carried for years, checking exits, checking faces, making certain that nothing and no one threatened the careful arrangement of her life. She caught sight of the housekeeper, Mrs. Ellery, standing near the servants' entrance and gave her a small, sharp nod. It was a signal they had used before, a silent confirmation that all was as it should be, that nothing had gone wrong below stairs. Mrs. Ellery returned the nod, though her expression carried a flicker of unease that Margaret did not have time to examine. The truth was, Mrs. Ellery had grown fond of Eliza over the years, fonder than her position allowed her to admit. She had watched the girl grow from a frightened, grieving child into a thoughtful young woman, always more curious about the world than her circumstances allowed her to explore. It troubled Mrs. Ellery to see her shut away like an embarrassment, especially on a night when the rest of the house sparkled with light and laughter. But Mrs. Ellery had also served this family long enough to know better than to question Margaret's decisions aloud. Whatever reasons lay behind the concealment of the girl in the attic, they were reasons Margaret guarded as fiercely as a locked door. Meanwhile, across the ballroom, Duke Adrian Wardour endured another round of introductions with the patient, practiced calm he had cultivated over years of similar evenings. He nodded, he smiled where a smile was expected, he offered brief, courteous replies to questions about his estate, his horses, his plans for the coming season. None of it interested him. He had attended dozens of such gatherings in the past year alone, each one promising to be the evening he might finally meet a woman who did not simply see a title and a fortune when she looked at him. He had begun to doubt such a woman existed in rooms like this one. His closest companion that evening, a longtime friend named Nathaniel Cole, sidled up beside him with 2 glasses of wine and a knowing look. "You have the expression of a man attending his own funeral," Nathaniel said, handing him a glass. "Smile, Adrian. Half the mothers in this room have already decided you belong to their daughters." "That is precisely the trouble," Adrian said quietly. "I would prefer to be chosen for something other than my title." "A reasonable wish," Nathaniel said, "though not one this room is equipped to grant." He glanced around at the swirling crowd, the glittering jewels, the carefully rehearsed laughter. "Still, you must dance with someone eventually, or the gossip will say you found the whole evening beneath you." Adrian sighed and let his eyes drift once more across the room, though he was not entirely certain what he was searching for. It was then that Margaret arrived with Charlotte at her side, offering the kind of eager, polished introduction he had heard a dozen times already that night. "Your Grace," Margaret said, her curtsy perfectly measured, "may I present my daughter Charlotte?" Adrian offered the expected bow, the expected pleasant words, and led Charlotte into a dance because refusing would have caused more talk than accepting. Charlotte was a pleasant enough partner, quick with compliments and eager to please, but Adrian found his attention wandering even as they turned across the floor together. His gaze drifted, without his quite meaning it to, toward the tall windows at the edge of the ballroom, and beyond them, toward the dark shape of the house rising above the garden. He was not sure what had drawn his eye there earlier in the evening, some small light in an upper window, gone now, that had struck him as strangely out of place amid all this deliberate splendor. It was foolish, he told himself, to be more curious about an empty window than about the young woman currently smiling up at him mid-turn. And yet the thought would not quite leave him. The dance ended, and Adrian excused himself with practiced grace, retreating toward the edge of the room where the crowd was thinner and the air easier to breathe. Nathaniel found him there a few minutes later, arms crossed, studying the room with the detached expression of a man watching a performance he had already seen too many times. "You dance with the heart, girl," Nathaniel observed. Her mother looked ready to burst with pride. "She is pleasant," Adrian said, "nothing more." "High praise from you." Nathaniel took a slow sip of his wine. "You know, I heard something curious earlier. One of the footmen mentioned there was another young lady in that household, a cousin, or a ward, something of that nature, who was not permitted to attend tonight. Kept upstairs, apparently, the entire evening." Adrian's attention sharpened, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. Kept upstairs? For what reason? No one seemed to know precisely. The footman said only that Mrs. Hart gave very particular instructions that the girl not be seen by any guest, and certainly not introduced. Nathaniel shrugged. Strange thing to do, on a night meant to display one's family in the best possible light. Unless, of course, there is something about the girl one would rather not display. Adrian said nothing for a long moment, turning the information over in his mind. He thought again of the small light in the attic window, extinguished so abruptly, as though someone had been watching the party from a place they were never meant to be seen from at all. "Do you know her name?" he asked. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow at the question, but answered readily enough. "Eliza, I believe, Eliza Hart. Some relation on the late husband's side, though the footman wasn't certain of the details. Why the sudden interest?" Adrian did not answer immediately. He was remembering, instead, an encounter from earlier that same week. A sharp-tongued young woman on a village road, who had spoken to him with a directness no one in this ballroom would ever dare use, unaware that she was addressing a duke. He had thought of her more than once since, an unusual thing for him, given how little time he had spent in her company. He did not yet have any reason to connect that woman to the name Nathaniel had just spoken. And yet something in him, some quiet instinct he had learned to trust over the years, told him the two might be one and the same. "No particular reason," he said finally, though his eyes drifted once more toward the tall windows and the dark house beyond them. Merely curious. Nathaniel studied his friend for a moment, clearly unconvinced, but he knew better than to press when Adrian wore that particular expression, thoughtful, distant, already half a step ahead of whatever conversation was happening around him. "Well," he said instead, "curious or not, you had better dance again soon, or Lady Fenwick will accuse you of favoritism toward the Hart family, and we shall never hear the end of it." Adrian allowed himself a faint smile and rejoined the crowd, offering the expected courtesies to the expected partners, all the while turning one thought quietly over in his mind. A young woman hidden away on the very night her family most wished to shine, and a name, Eliza Hart, that seemed to mean far more than anyone in that glittering ballroom was willing to say aloud. Upstairs, in the quiet dark of the attic, Eliza slept fitfully, unaware that her name had already traveled from a servant's careless remark into the ear of the one man in the house who had both the power and the curiosity to wonder why it had been hidden at all. The ball continued below her for hours more, bright and loud, and full of laughter that never once reached the small, cold room where she lay. But something had shifted in the current of the evening, quietly, invisibly, the way a single stone dropped into still water sends ripples outward long after it has sunk from sight. By the time the last carriages rolled away from the house in the pale hours before dawn, Margaret believed the danger of the evening had passed. She climbed the stairs to her own room exhausted but satisfied, certain that her careful arrangements had held, that her secrets remained exactly where she had buried them. She had no way of knowing that a seed of curiosity had already been planted in the mind of the one man, whose attention she had worked so hard to keep away from her niece. A curiosity that would not rest until it had uncovered every truth she had spent years trying to conceal. Morning came slowly over the house, the golden light of dawn creeping across the attic floor long before anyone stirred below. Eliza woke stiff and cold, the events of the night before settling over her like a heavy blanket she could not quite shake off. She lay still for a while, listening to the silence, trying to separate what had actually happened from what she might have imagined in her half-sleep. The music, the carriages, the tall figure stepping down in the moonlight, drawing every eye in the crowd without seeming to try. She remembered it all clearly enough, and yet none of it felt entirely real, as though she had watched someone else's life unfold through that small round window. What she remembered most clearly, though, had nothing to do with the ball at all. It was a memory from 4 days earlier, one she had turned over in her mind so often since that it had begun to feel worn smooth, like a stone carried in a pocket. She had been sent into the village that morning on an ordinary errand, carrying a basket of mending back to the seamstress, and a short list of items her aunt required from the market. The road had been quiet, the hedgerows heavy with late summer green, and Eliza had walked slowly, in no particular hurry to return to the house and its endless small tasks. She had just reached the narrow bend where the road dipped toward the old stone bridge, when a horse came around the curve at a pace far too quick for the width of the lane. Eliza had barely enough time to step back against the hedge before the rider drew the animal up sharply, close enough that she felt the horse's warm breath against her sleeve. "You might have announced yourself," she had said, her heart pounding more from surprise than fear, before nearly riding down an innocent traveler. The man atop the horse, dressed plainly, without any of the ornament she might have expected from a gentleman of means, his coat dusty from the road, had looked down at her with an expression of genuine surprise, as though scolding had not been among the responses he expected. "My apologies," he had said, dismounting with an ease that suggested long familiarity with horses and roads alike. "The bend caught me faster than I judged. Are you unharmed?" "Unharmed, though somewhat shaken," Eliza had answered, straightening her basket and lifting her chin in a manner she hoped conveyed more composure than she felt. "It is fortunate for you that I am not the sort to faint at the first sign of trouble." Something in his face had shifted then, not quite a smile, but something close to it, an expression of quiet amusement he seemed to be suppressing out of politeness. "Fortunate indeed. though I suspect very little troubles you if a runaway horse fails to manage it. Very little troubles me that I cannot solve with a sharp word or a firm hand, she had replied, and immediately wondered if she had spoken too boldly to a stranger, gentleman or not. But he had laughed then, a genuine, surprised sound, and something about the honesty of it had put her at ease. They had walked together for a short distance after that, he leading his horse by the reins, she carrying her basket, exchanging a conversation that had felt, to Eliza, unlike any she had shared with a stranger before. He had asked her opinion on matters most gentlemen never thought to ask a young woman: what she thought of the harvest that year, whether she believed the new roads being built through the county would help or harm the small farms along them, what she made of the endless talk of a certain duke's approaching ball, which even the village gossips could not stop discussing. I imagine every unmarried woman for 50 miles is preparing her finest gown, Eliza had said, with more amusement than envy in her voice. Though I confess I find the whole business rather tiresome to hear about. A man chooses a wife as though selecting a horse at market, and the whole county holds its breath waiting to see which one he picks. The stranger had gone quiet for a moment at that, an odd, considering silence that Eliza had not understood at the time. Perhaps, he had said carefully, the man in question finds the business just as tiresome as you do. Perhaps he too grows weary of being looked at as a prize to be won, rather than a person to be known. Then he ought to say so, Eliza had answered, instead of hosting balls that only make the tiresome business worse. He had laughed again at that, shaking his head slightly, as though she had said something both foolish and entirely correct at once. A fair point, and one I shall consider carefully. They had parted ways not long after, at the fork where her road turned back toward the house, and his continued on toward the larger estates beyond the village. He had never given his name, and she had not thought to ask for it, too caught up in the easy strangeness of a conversation that felt more honest than anything she usually exchanged with the people around her. She had walked the rest of the way home with a small, private smile she could not quite explain, turning his words over in her mind long after his horse's hoofbeats had faded into the distance. It was only now, lying in the cold attic the morning after the ball, replaying the image of the tall figure stepping down from his carriage in the moonlight, that a strange and unsettling thought began to take shape in Eliza's mind. The set of his shoulders, the quiet, considering way he had studied the crowd, the plain dress, so unlike the ornament she had expected of a duke, which had struck her as odd even from a distance. She sat up slowly, her pulse quickening. It could not be. Surely a duke would not travel the country roads alone and unannounced, chatting with a servant girl about harvests and horses as though rank meant nothing at all. And yet the thought, once it had taken root, refused to be uprooted again. She thought of his laugh, of the careful way he had chosen his words when she spoke of the ball, of that odd, thoughtful silence before he answered her about the man who found himself tiresomely regarded as a prize. If it were true, if the man she had scolded on the village road and the Duke of Wardour were one and the same, then Eliza had spoken to him with a bluntness she would never have dared if she had known his true rank. The thought made her cheeks warm, half with embarrassment and half with something she did not yet have a name for. A soft knock at the attic door interrupted her thoughts. Grace slipped in again, carrying a bowl of porridge and a look of barely contained excitement. "You will never guess what's being said below stairs this morning," Grace said, setting the bowl down and perching on the edge of the narrow bed. "The whole house is buzzing over it." "Tell me," Eliza said, grateful for the distraction, though her mind was still half occupied with the memory of the village road. "They say the Duke barely danced last night, except when he could not politely refuse. They say he spent most of the evening watching the room rather than joining it, as though he were searching for someone who never appeared." Grace's eyes were wide with the pleasure of good gossip. "And one of the footmen says he asked after a name, your name, Eliza. He asked who you were and why you were not among the guests." Eliza's heart gave a sharp, startled lurch. "My name. Are you certain?" "Certain as I can be, second-hand as it is. Your aunt hasn't heard yet, and I'd not be the one to tell her if I were you. She'd have a fit to shake the rafters." Grace lowered her voice further, though there was no one else nearby to overhear. "What I want to know is why a duke would ask after a girl he's never even met, hidden away in an attic on the one night she wasn't allowed to be seen." Eliza said nothing for a long moment, staring down at the bowl of porridge cooling in her hands, her thoughts racing far ahead of anything she was prepared to say aloud. If the man on the village road truly had been the Duke of Wardour, then he already knew something of her, her manner, her voice, the sharp opinions she had never intended a stranger of such rank to hear. And if he had asked after her name at the ball, unaware or perhaps only just beginning to suspect the truth of who she was, then whatever careful concealment her aunt had built around her was already beginning to crack, whether Margaret knew it yet or not. "I don't know why," Eliza said finally, which was, as far as it went, entirely true. "But I intend to find out." Grace grinned, delighted by the prospect of further drama unfolding in a house that rarely offered any. "Well, you'll have to be careful how you go about it. Your aunt has eyes everywhere and ears besides. If she learns the Duke so much as spoke your name, she'll have you locked in that attic until Christmas." "She may try," Eliza said, and found, to her own surprise, that the thought of her aunt's anger did not frighten her nearly as much as it once had. Something had shifted in her overnight, some quiet resolve settling into place beside the curiosity that had been building in her for weeks. She was tired of hiding without understanding why. She was tired of being told her name was a danger to be managed rather than a thing that belonged to her. Whatever secret her aunt had spent years burying, whatever connection existed between her mother's family and the House of Wardour, Eliza intended to uncover it, not for the sake of a duke's attention, though she could not deny the flutter of curiosity his interest had stirred in her, but for her own sake. For the sake of finally understanding who she truly was, after a lifetime of being told, in 100 quiet ways, that the answer was better left unknown. Grace left soon after, promising to bring word if she heard anything more, and Eliza sat alone in the attic for a long while, turning the bowl of cooling porridge in her hands without eating much of it at all. Below her, the house had begun to stir with the ordinary business of the morning after a grand event, servants clearing away the last traces of the party. Her aunt, no doubt, already planning her next strategy for securing Charlotte's future. But Eliza's thoughts were elsewhere entirely, circling back again and again to a locked door at the end of the east hallway, and to a trunk that had once belonged to her mother, and to a stranger on a village road who had looked at her, however briefly, as though she were a person worth truly seeing. Whatever answers waited behind that locked door, she decided, watching the morning light strengthen across the attic floor, she would find a way to reach them. No matter what her aunt had ordered, no matter how carefully she had been told to disappear. 3 days passed before Eliza found her opportunity, 3 days of careful waiting while the household settled back into its usual rhythm and her aunt's attention turned, as it always did, toward securing Charlotte's next appearance in society. Margaret spoke of little else at supper each evening, which families had sent invitations, which acquaintances might be persuaded to host a gathering where the Duke could be encountered again, seemingly by chance. Eliza listened to it all with a quiet, careful patience, nodding when nodding was expected, offering nothing that might draw her aunt's suspicion. It was on the 4th morning, when Margaret and Charlotte departed for the milliner's shop in the village to select fabric for a new gown, that Eliza finally found the house empty enough, and quiet enough, to attempt what she had been planning since the night of the ball. Mrs. Ellery had taken the younger servants to the market for the week's provisions, leaving only old Edmund, the groundskeeper, dozing in his chair near the kitchen fire, half deaf and entirely uninterested in the comings and goings of the house above him. Eliza waited until she heard his soft, steady snoring drift up through the floorboards before she made her way toward the east hallway, her heart beating fast against her ribs. The locked door stood exactly as it always had, plain, unremarkable, the sort of door a stranger might pass without a second glance. But Eliza had passed it 1,000 times over the years, and every single time she had felt the same small pull of curiosity, the same quiet certainty that whatever lay behind it mattered more than her aunt had ever admitted. She had never before dared to try the handle. Today she did. To her surprise, it turned easily beneath her hand. The door was not locked at all, or if it had been, someone had forgotten to secure it properly after the last time it was opened. Eliza stood frozen for a moment, half expecting the door to swing open onto nothing more than an ordinary storage room, some collection of old furniture and forgotten linens that had never merited the mystery she had built around it in her mind. Instead, she stepped into a room that had clearly been left untouched for years. Dust lay thick over every surface, catching the thin light that filtered through a single curtained window. A narrow bed stood against one wall, stripped of its linens, and beside it, a small writing desk covered in a fine layer of gray dust. But it was the far wall that drew Eliza's attention immediately, her breath catching in her throat. Portraits. A row of them, hung with the kind of care that suggested they had once been treasured, before whatever had happened in this house made someone decide they were better left hidden away. Eliza crossed the room slowly, her footsteps muffled by the thick dust, and stood before the largest of them. The woman in the portrait looked back at her with familiar eyes. Eliza's own eyes, she realized with a jolt that ran through her entire body. The same shape, the same shade of soft brown, the same faint upward tilt at the corners that Eliza had always thought made her look perpetually curious, even as a child. The woman in the portrait wore a gown from perhaps 20 years past, her dark hair arranged in a style Eliza did not recognize. But her face was one Eliza had spent years trying to remember clearly and never quite managing. Her mother. Eliza reached out with a trembling hand, not quite touching the canvas, as though afraid it might disappear if she did. She had only a handful of true memories of her mother, fragments really, the sound of a particular lullaby, the smell of lavender, the warmth of being held close during a thunderstorm. Her mother had died when Eliza was very young, and in the years since, Margaret had spoken of her so rarely and so carefully that Eliza had come to believe there was simply nothing more to know. Clearly, that had never been true. She turned to the small writing desk, brushing away the dust with the edge of her sleeve, and found a stack of letters tied together with a faded ribbon, tucked into the desk's single drawer. Her hands shook as she loosened the ribbon and unfolded the topmost letter, the paper brittle and yellowed with age. The handwriting was elegant, formal, clearly the hand of someone accustomed to writing official correspondence. Eliza's eyes moved quickly over the words, her understanding building slowly, piece by piece, as the meaning of what she was reading began to take shape. The letter spoke of an old agreement, made generations past, between the Hart family and the House of Wardour, an inheritance claim tied to land that had once belonged jointly to both families, before a marriage between them decades ago had bound their fortunes together in ways that had, over time, been quietly forgotten by everyone except the lawyers who still maintained the old records. The letter referred, again and again, to the rightful line of succession, and the claim through the female heir, language Eliza did not fully understand, but which sent a cold, uneasy shiver through her all the same. She dug further into the stack, finding more letters, some clearly written by her mother, others addressed to her mother from a solicitor whose name meant nothing to Eliza, but whose careful, formal tone suggested a matter of considerable importance. One letter, dated only a few months before Eliza's mother had died, spoke of a decision to be made, whether to pursue the old claim formally, and risk exposing the family's connection to the Wardour estate publicly, or to let the matter rest quietly as it had rested for so many years already. Eliza sat down heavily on the edge of the dusty bed, the letters trembling in her hands. Her mother had known. Her mother had possessed some claim, some connection to the very family whose current head had only days ago asked after Eliza's name at a ball she had been forbidden to attend. And Margaret had known all along. Margaret had locked this room, hidden these portraits, buried these letters, and never once spoken a word of any of it to the niece she had raised in careful, deliberate ignorance. The question that rose in Eliza's mind, sharp and unavoidable, was simple and yet enormous. Why? Why hide a connection to one of the most powerful families in the county, rather than use it to Eliza's advantage, as any reasonable guardian surely would have done. Unless, Eliza thought slowly, turning the pieces over in her mind the way she might turn over an unfamiliar object, examining it from every angle, the connection was not an advantage to be used at all. Unless it was a threat not to Eliza, but to someone else entirely. To Charlotte. The realization settled over her slowly, cold and certain. If Eliza's claim through her mother's line was real, if it carried any legal weight at all, then its existence might threaten Charlotte's own prospects in ways Margaret could never risk. Perhaps the old agreement between the families meant that any daughter of the rightful line held some precedence, some claim, that could interfere with an ordinary match between Charlotte and the current Duke. Perhaps Margaret's frantic insistence on hiding Eliza away had never truly been about propriety or embarrassment at all. Perhaps it had always been about protecting Charlotte's future from the shadow of Eliza's own. A sound from downstairs, the creak of the front door, voices in the entrance hall jolted Eliza from her thoughts. Margaret and Charlotte had returned from the village earlier than expected. Eliza scrambled to gather the letters, her hands clumsy with haste, tying the faded ribbon back around them with fingers that would not quite steady themselves. She hesitated for only a moment before tucking the small bundle of letters into the pocket of her apron, unwilling to leave them behind now that she had finally found them, now that they held answers she had spent her whole life searching for without knowing it. She cast one last glance at the portrait of her mother, memorizing the shape of that familiar face, before slipping quietly from the room and pulling the door shut behind her, exactly as she had found it. She reached the attic stairs just as she heard her aunt's voice rising from the entrance hall below, sharp with its usual note of authority. "Eliza! Eliza, where has that girl got to now?" Eliza forced her breathing to steady, smoothed her apron over the small, telltale bundle hidden within its folds, and descended the stairs with as much calm as she could manage, her heart still pounding from the discovery she carried with her. "Here, Aunt," she said, appearing at the bottom of the stairs with an expression she hoped conveyed nothing more than ordinary obedience. "I was tidying the linen closet, as you asked last week." Margaret's sharp eyes studied her for a moment, searching, as they always seemed to, for some sign of disobedience or deceit. Eliza held her aunt's gaze steadily, careful not to let even a flicker of the enormous secret she now carried show on her face. "See that it is finished by supper," Margaret said finally, apparently satisfied, and turned to direct Charlotte toward the parlor, already speaking again of fabric samples and the milliner's opinion on the latest fashions from the city. Eliza watched them go, her hand resting lightly against the pocket of her apron, feeling the faint, papery weight of the letters hidden there. Whatever her aunt had spent years concealing, whatever fear had driven her to lock away a room full of memories and hide a niece away like a shameful secret, Eliza now held a piece of the truth in her own hands. It was only a piece. She knew there was more to uncover, more questions than answers still tangled together in her mind. But for the first time since her mother's death, Eliza felt something shift inside her, not confusion, not the quiet, patient obedience she had worn for so many years like a second skin, but something closer to purpose. She would learn the whole truth, whatever it cost her, whatever her aunt's anger might bring down upon her once the deception was finally uncovered. Eliza intended to understand exactly who she was, and exactly what claim, if any, she truly held to a name that had, until only days ago, meant nothing at all to her. That evening, as the house settled into its usual quiet, Eliza sat alone in the attic with the bundle of letters spread carefully across her lap, reading each one again by candlelight, searching for every scrap of meaning she could find within the careful, formal language of lawyers and long-dead relatives. Somewhere beyond the small round window, the world continued on as it always had, unaware of the quiet reckoning taking shape within the walls of the Hart household. But Eliza, for the first time in longer than she could remember, felt herself standing at the very beginning of something far larger than the small, careful life she had always been told to live. 2 weeks passed, and in that time the Hart household received an invitation that sent Margaret into a flurry of preparation, unlike anything Eliza had witnessed before. Lady Fenwick, a woman of considerable influence in the county and no small rival to Margaret's ambitions, had announced a garden gathering to be held at her estate, and more importantly, as Margaret repeated at least a dozen times over supper, the Duke of Wardour had already confirmed his attendance. "This is our chance," Margaret said, pacing the length of the parlor with an energy that made the candles flicker. "A garden party is far more intimate than a ball. There will be no crowd of 50 young women competing for a single dance. Charlotte, you must wear the green muslin. It brings out the color in your eyes, and you must find a way to speak with him about something other than the weather. Men of his sort grow bored of empty pleasantries." Charlotte nodded along, though Eliza, watching from her usual quiet corner of the room, noticed a flicker of exhaustion cross her cousin's face before it was quickly smoothed away. Charlotte had spent 2 weeks now living under the relentless pressure of her mother's ambitions, and Eliza found herself feeling, unexpectedly, a flicker of sympathy for a cousin who had never once been particularly unkind to her, even if she had never been especially warm either. "And Eliza," Margaret said, turning suddenly, her sharp eyes finding her niece in the corner, "you will remain here as before. Lady Fenwick's gatherings are smaller, more easily observed. There will be no attic to hide you in if word gets out that you attended without invitation." "Of course, Aunt," Eliza said, keeping her voice carefully neutral, though something in her had hardened since the discovery in the locked room. She no longer felt the same quiet, unquestioning obedience she once had. She simply understood now that patience was a tool as useful as defiance, and that the truth she carried in a small bundle of letters, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the attic, was worth protecting until she chose the moment to reveal it herself. The day of the garden party arrived bright and warm, the kind of late summer afternoon that seemed designed for exactly the sort of gathering Lady Fenwick had planned. Margaret and Charlotte departed in their finest clothes, leaving instructions with Mrs. Ellery that Eliza was to remain occupied with household tasks and under no circumstances venture beyond the garden gate. For the first 2 hours of the afternoon, Eliza obeyed those instructions faithfully enough, working through a list of mending that Mrs. Ellery had set out for her in the small sewing room off the kitchen. But as the afternoon wore on and the house grew quiet with most of the staff occupied elsewhere, Eliza found herself drawn, almost without deciding to be, toward the garden. It was not defiance, she told herself, simply a walk to clear her head after hours bent over needlework. The Fenwick estate bordered the Hart property along its eastern edge, separated only by a low stone wall and a stretch of wild hedgerow that had grown thick and tangled over the years. Eliza had wandered this border many times as a child, before Margaret's watchfulness had tightened around her, and something in her feet seemed to remember the old path even as her mind insisted she was simply taking the air. She heard the party before she saw it, distant music, the soft murmur of many voices, laughter carried on the warm breeze. She told herself she would only look, only satisfy her curiosity from the safety of the hedgerow, and then return to her mending before anyone noticed her absence. She had just reached a gap in the hedge that offered a clear view of the Fenwick lawn, dotted with small tables and colorful parasols, when a sudden cry of distress from somewhere close by startled her from her hiding place. A young girl, no older than 7 or 8, had wandered from the party and become tangled in the thorny undergrowth at the edge of the hedgerow. Her white dress caught fast, tears already streaming down her face as she struggled uselessly against the thorns. Eliza did not hesitate. She pushed through the gap in the hedge and knelt beside the frightened child, speaking in the same soft, steady voice she had once used to calm frightened animals on the estate. "Hold still now, you'll only tangle yourself further. Let me see." It took several minutes of careful, patient work to free the girl's dress from the thorns without tearing it further, and by the time Eliza had finished, a small crowd had gathered at the edge of the garden, drawn by the sound of the child's earlier crying. Eliza rose quickly, brushing leaves from her plain gray dress, intending to slip back through the hedge before anyone thought to question who she was. But the child, now free and grateful, threw her arms around Eliza's waist with the uncomplicated affection of a small girl relieved of her distress, and called out loudly enough for the nearby guests to hear, "She saved my dress. Look, Mama, she saved it. A young woman rushed forward, clearly the child's mother, full of relieved thanks, and within moments Eliza found herself surrounded by curious guests, all wondering aloud who this unfamiliar young woman in the plain gray dress might be. She had no way to retreat now without drawing far more attention than a quiet departure would have caused. "I am visiting the Hart family," Eliza said carefully, choosing her words with the same caution she had learned from years of practice, and heard the child's distress from the garden path. "I am glad I could be of use." It should have ended there, a small, forgettable moment of kindness quickly absorbed back into the larger flow of the party. But across the lawn, near the refreshment tables where he had been enduring yet another round of polite, empty conversation, Duke Adrian Wardour had turned at the sound of the commotion, and his eyes had found Eliza's face the moment she rose from the hedgerow. Recognition struck him immediately, unmistakable and complete. The sharp-tongued young woman from the village road. The one who had scolded him for riding too fast around a blind bend, who had spoken to him with more honesty in 10 minutes than most of society managed in 10 years. He had thought of her often in the weeks since, more often than he cared to admit even to Nathaniel, and had begun quietly making inquiries of his own, though nothing definite had yet come of them. And now here she stood, in the Fenwick garden, wearing the plain gray dress of a servant or a poor relation, kneeling in the dirt to free a child's dress from thorns, while the assembled guests looked on with polite, distant approval, as though her kindness were a pleasant curiosity rather than an act worth genuine admiration. Adrian crossed the lawn before he had fully decided to do so, drawn forward by an impulse he did not pause to examine. "That was well done," he said, arriving at the edge of the small crowd just as Eliza was preparing to retreat toward the hedgerow once more. Not every guest at a garden party would think to kneel in the dirt for a frightened child. Eliza turned at the sound of his voice, and Adrian watched the recognition move across her face in stages, first simple surprise at being addressed by a stranger, then a slow, dawning realization that widened her eyes and brought a flush of color to her cheeks. "You," she said before she could stop herself, and then, remembering herself, dropped into a hasty, awkward curtsy. "Your Grace, I did not realize I had no notion that you were the same. The same man who nearly rode you down on a country lane and was rightfully scolded for it," Adrian finished, and the corner of his mouth lifted in the same amused expression she remembered from that first encounter. "Yes. I'm afraid I am exactly that man." A ripple of curious whispers moved through the small crowd of guests still gathered nearby, watching this exchange with obvious fascination. The Duke of Wardour, addressing an unknown young woman in a plain gray dress with such evident familiarity, as though they were old acquaintances rather than strangers meeting for the first time in society. Eliza was acutely aware of the eyes upon them, aware of how quickly word of this moment would travel back to her aunt, aware of every rule she had just broken simply by standing here, in full view of Lady Fenwick's guests, speaking with the very man Margaret had worked so hard to keep her hidden from. "I should return home," she said quickly. "I was not meant to attend this gathering, and I fear I have already overstepped by being seen here at all." "Not meant to attend," Adrian repeated, and something in his tone had shifted, grown more careful, more considering. "And yet here you are, kneeling in the dirt to help a frightened child while the invited guests merely watched. I find myself curious, miss." He paused, waiting for her to supply the name he already suspected he knew. "Hart," Eliza said after a brief hesitation. "Eliza Hart." Something flickered across Adrian's face at the confirmation, not surprise exactly, but a kind of quiet certainty settling into place, as though a puzzle he had been assembling piece by piece had just found its final corner. "Eliza Hart," he repeated softly. I had begun to wonder if that name belonged to a real person, or merely to a rumor whispered among servants. "I do not understand your meaning, Your Grace." "I mean," Adrian said, lowering his voice so that only she could hear it clearly over the surrounding chatter of the garden, "that I asked after you at my own ball some weeks ago, and was told only that you existed, and that you had been kept away from the gathering by your aunt's particular instruction. I have wondered since then why a family would go to such trouble to hide away a young woman capable of the kindness I have just witnessed." Eliza's heart was pounding now, a mixture of alarm and something else entirely, something warmer and more dangerous than simple fear. "My aunt has her reasons, Your Grace, though I confess I have only recently begun to understand them myself." Before Adrian could press further, a new voice cut sharply across the garden, carrying the unmistakable edge of barely controlled panic. "Eliza!" Margaret had arrived, Charlotte trailing behind her with an expression of confused alarm, and the color had drained entirely from Margaret's face at the sight of her niece, standing in open conversation with the Duke of Wardour, in full view of half the county's most prominent families. "Your Grace," Margaret said, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure, "I must apologize most sincerely. My niece was not meant to attend this gathering. She is unwell, and I fear the excitement of the afternoon has overtaxed her. Eliza, come, we must return home at once." Adrian's eyes moved from Margaret's pale, panicked face to Eliza's carefully neutral one, and something in the exchange between aunt and niece, the barely concealed fear in one, the quiet, resolute calm in the other, told him with sudden, absolute clarity that whatever secret lay beneath this family's careful arrangements was far larger and far stranger than a simple matter of social embarrassment. "There is no need for apology," he said smoothly, though his eyes remained on Eliza a moment longer than strict politeness required. "Your niece has done nothing this afternoon but demonstrate a kindness I found genuinely admirable. I hope our paths cross again soon, Miss Hart." Eliza managed a small, careful curtsy, aware of every eye in the garden now fixed upon the small drama unfolding before them, and allowed her aunt to lead her away toward the garden gate with a grip on her arm that was, once again, far tighter than necessary. They walked in silence back toward the Hart property, Margaret's face a mask of controlled fury that Eliza knew would break the moment they were safely behind closed doors. Charlotte trailed a few steps behind, glancing between her mother and her cousin with an expression Eliza could not quite read, not anger exactly, but something closer to bewildered curiosity, as though Charlotte too were only now beginning to sense that there was far more to her quiet, hidden cousin than she had ever been permitted to know. Behind them, in the Fenwick garden, Duke Adrian Wardour remained standing near the hedgerow for a long moment after the Hart family had departed, his gaze fixed thoughtfully on the space where Eliza had stood only minutes before. Nathaniel found him there, curiosity evident on his face. "Well," Nathaniel said, "that was certainly more interesting than the last 3 garden parties combined. Care to explain what exactly I just witnessed?" "Not yet," Adrian said quietly, his mind already turning over the pieces of a puzzle he was now more determined than ever to solve completely. "But I intend to find out everything there is to know about Eliza Hart, and about whatever her aunt is so desperately trying to hide." The days following the garden party passed in a tense, uneasy quiet within the Hart household. Margaret had not raised her voice once since their return, which frightened Eliza far more than any shouting could have. Instead, her aunt moved through the house with a cold, deliberate precision, issuing instructions in clipped, careful sentences, watching Eliza with an intensity that made every meal feel like a slow, silent trial. "You will not leave this house," Margaret said finally on the 3rd evening, breaking the careful silence she had maintained since the garden. "Not for errands, not for air, not for any reason whatsoever, until I have decided what is to be done with you." "Done with me," Eliza repeated quietly. "As though I were a piece of furniture to be moved from room to room, aunt, rather than a person with some say in her own life." Margaret's eyes flashed with something close to genuine anger. "You have no notion, Eliza, of what your carelessness this afternoon may have cost this family. None whatsoever." "Then tell me," Eliza said, and something in her voice, steady, unafraid, entirely unlike the quiet obedience she had offered for so many years, seemed to catch her aunt off guard. "Tell me what it is you have spent my whole life hiding from me. I am tired of being punished for a truth I have never once been permitted to hear." For a moment, something flickered across Margaret's face, not quite guilt, but something close to it, a brief crack in the careful armor she had worn for so long. Then it hardened again, and she turned away without answering, leaving Eliza alone in the parlor with nothing but her own racing thoughts for company. Eliza did not press further that evening. She had learned, in the weeks since discovering the locked room, that patience served her better than confrontation, and she suspected the answers she sought would come not from her aunt's reluctant admissions, but from some source beyond the walls of this careful, guarded household. She thought often, in the quiet hours before sleep, of the Duke's words in the garden, "I intend to find out everything there is to know," and wondered, with a flutter of nerves she could not entirely suppress, whether he might succeed where her own efforts had so far only partially reached. She did not have to wonder for long. 10 days after the garden party, an invitation arrived at the Hart household that sent the entire family into a state of confused alarm. It came not from Lady Fenwick or any of the usual county hostesses, but directly from the Wardour estate itself, addressed not to Margaret or Charlotte, as every previous invitation had been, but specifically and unmistakably to Miss Eliza Hart. Margaret read the letter 3 times before she finally set it down on the parlor table, her hands trembling slightly, her face pale with an emotion Eliza could not quite name. Fear, certainly, but something else beneath it, something closer to resignation, as though a reckoning she had long dreaded had finally, inevitably, arrived. "A private audience," Margaret said, her voice strangely hollow. "He requests a private audience with you, Eliza, at Wardour House 3 days from now. He has specifically requested that I accompany you and that I bring," her voice caught slightly, "any family papers pertaining to your mother's line." Eliza's heart began to pound. How could he know to ask for such papers, aunt, unless he already suspects something of what I discovered myself? Margaret's eyes snapped up, sharp with sudden suspicion. "What have you discovered exactly?" There seemed little point in further concealment now. Eliza rose and retrieved the small bundle of letters from beneath the loose floorboard in the attic, where she had kept them hidden since the day she found them, and laid them on the parlor table before her aunt without a word. Margaret stared at the bundle for a long moment, her face draining of what little color remained in it. "You found the room." "I found the room," Eliza confirmed. "I found my mother's portrait and letters that speak of an old claim between our family and the House of Wardour. I do not fully understand what they mean, aunt, but I understand enough to know that you have spent years hiding this from me for reasons that had far more to do with Charlotte's future than with any concern for my own well-being." Margaret sank slowly into a chair, the fight seeming to drain out of her all at once, leaving behind only a tired, defeated woman who looked, for the first time in Eliza's memory, genuinely old. "You do not understand the whole of it," she said quietly. "You cannot, not from a handful of old letters." "Then tell me," Eliza said again, softer this time though no less resolute. "Before we arrive at Wardour House, and I am forced to learn the truth from a stranger rather than from you." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing absently over the faded ribbon that bound the letters together. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its usual sharp authority, replaced by something Eliza had never heard from her before, a kind of weary honesty. "Your mother," Margaret began, "was the elder daughter of a family whose fortunes had long been tied, through an old marriage agreement, to the House of Wardour. When the current Duke's grandfather died without settling certain claims to a parcel of land held jointly between the families, the matter was left unresolved, a legal tangle that meant, in essence, that whichever daughter of the direct line eventually married would carry with her a claim to that land, a claim significant enough to alter the fortunes of whichever family she joined. And my mother held that claim," Eliza said slowly, pieces beginning to fall into place. "Your mother held it, and chose, against the wishes of her own family, to marry your father instead of pursuing a match that would have secured the Wardour connection formally. It was considered, at the time, a scandal, a woman turning away from such an advantageous position for the sake of a simple, ordinary marriage. Margaret's voice grew quieter still. When your mother died and you were left in my care, I discovered that the old claim had never been formally settled. It had simply been left dormant, waiting in the eyes of the law for the next generation to either pursue it or let it finally lapse. And you feared, Eliza said, understanding now with sudden, cold clarity, that if my claim were ever acknowledged it might interfere with Charlotte's own prospects, that it might complicate or even prevent entirely any match between Charlotte and the current Duke. Margaret did not deny it. The old agreements are complex, and I do not fully understand them myself. But my solicitor warned me, years ago, that if your claim were ever formally raised, it could delay or entirely block any marriage between Charlotte and a Duke of Wardour, until the old matter of the land was properly resolved between our families. I told myself I was protecting you as much as Charlotte by keeping the matter buried. I told myself the claim was worthless without proper legal pursuit, and that no harm could come from simply letting it rest. But you never told me, Eliza said. You let me believe there was nothing more to my mother than a portrait I couldn't quite remember and a handful of hazy childhood memories. You let me believe I was nothing, Aunt, when all along I held a name that mattered. Margaret's eyes were wet now, though she blinked the tears back with visible effort. I am not proud of what I have done, Eliza. I told myself it was necessary. I told myself Charlotte's future depended on your silence. I did not consider until far too late what it might cost you to grow up believing yourself unworthy of the very things I feared you might one day claim. The parlor fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Eliza looked down at the bundle of letters between them, at the fragile, faded proof of a truth that had shaped her entire life without her ever knowing it existed. We will go to Wardour House, she said finally. And whatever the Duke wishes to know, I intend to answer him honestly, Aunt, whether or not the truth serves Charlotte's interests. 3 days later, the Hart carriage rolled up the long, tree-lined drive of the Wardour estate, a house far grander than anything Eliza had ever seen up close, its stone walls rising pale and imposing against the autumn sky. Margaret sat rigid beside her, the bundle of letters clutched tightly in her lap, while Eliza stared out the carriage window with a strange, steady calm settling over her, quite unlike the nervous fear she might have expected to feel. They were shown into a long gallery lined with portraits of Wardour ancestors stretching back generations, and it was there, standing beneath the watchful painted eyes of 100 years of dukes and duchesses, that Adrian finally appeared, dressed simply, his expression carefully composed but his eyes finding Eliza's the moment he entered the room. "Thank you for coming," he said, addressing them both with careful courtesy, though his attention lingered longest on Eliza. "I know this request was unusual and perhaps unwelcome. I hope you will understand once I explain myself why I felt it necessary." "You have made inquiries," Margaret said, her voice tight with barely restrained anxiety. "About my niece, about her mother's family." "I have," Adrian confirmed. "After our encounter in the Fenwick garden, I found myself unable to set aside my curiosity about a young woman who had been so deliberately hidden from society, on the very night my own household hosted its ball. I asked my solicitor to review the old family records, and what he uncovered surprised even him." He paused, glancing between them. "There exists an old agreement, dating back nearly 3 generations, tying certain lands and rights between our 2 families to the marriage of the elder female line. My solicitor believes, and I have since confirmed through further inquiry, that Eliza's mother was the rightful holder of that claim, a claim which, upon her death, passed directly to her daughter." Margaret's hands trembled visibly around the bundle of letters. "Your Grace, I assure you, my niece has no interest in pursuing any old claim, whatever inconvenience this matter might." "I did not summon you here to discuss inconvenience, Mrs. Hart," Adrian said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that left no room for argument. "I summoned you here because I believe your niece deserves to know the full truth of who she is and what she is owed, after what appears to have been years of deliberate concealment on your part." His eyes moved to Eliza, softening slightly. "I do not say this to cause you distress, Miss Hart. I say it because I believe you have been denied something that rightfully belongs to you, and I find myself unwilling to stand by and watch that continue, now that I understand the truth of it." Eliza felt the weight of the room settle around her, the watchful portraits, her aunt's trembling silence, the Duke's steady, earnest gaze fixed on her own. Whatever curtain had been drawn across her life for so many years, it had just been pulled fully, irrevocably back, and there would be no returning to the quiet, hidden existence she had known before. "Then tell me everything, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion building within her. "I have spent my whole life being told only pieces of the truth. I would very much like, at last, to hear the whole of it." Adrian led them from the long gallery into a smaller, more private study, where a stack of documents already lay waiting on the polished desk, gathered together by his solicitor in preparation for exactly this conversation. He gestured for Eliza and Margaret to sit, though he himself remained standing near the window, his expression thoughtful as he chose his words with evident care. "The agreement dates back to the marriage of my great-grandfather's sister to a Hart ancestor," he began. "As part of that union, certain lands along the northern boundary of this estate were held jointly between the two families, with the understanding that they would pass, in each generation, through the elder female line, rather than through the usual line of male inheritance. It was, even at the time, an unusual arrangement, and I suspect it survived only because it was rarely tested. Most generations produced sons who inherited the bulk of each family's holdings through ordinary means, leaving the old agreement to sit quietly in the background, referenced only in the most formal legal documents. But my mother's generation," Eliza said slowly, "produced only daughters." "Precisely," Adrian confirmed. "Your mother was the elder daughter of her generation, which meant that upon her marriage, the claim to that northern land should, by the terms of the original agreement, have passed formally to her, and through her, to her own eldest daughter." He glanced toward Margaret. "I understand your mother chose not to pursue the claim formally during her lifetime." "She chose to marry for love rather than for land," Margaret said quietly, some of her earlier defensiveness softening into something closer to old grief. "My sister always did prefer her own happiness to the family's advantage. It was, I confess, a source of considerable tension between us in the years before her death." Eliza turned sharply toward her aunt. "Your sister?" Margaret's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Eliza saw something in her aunt's expression that looked almost like shame. "I never told you the full truth of our relation, Eliza. I allowed you to believe I was a distant cousin, taking in an orphaned relative out of obligation. The truth is far simpler and far more painful. Your mother was my elder sister. When she died, I inherited not only the responsibility of raising you, but also the burden of a family claim I did not know how to manage, and frankly, did not wish to manage at all, given how much trouble it had already caused between us in life." The revelation landed heavily in the quiet study. Eliza had spent her whole life believing herself a distant relation, tolerated rather than truly wanted, when in truth her own aunt had been hiding an even closer bond than either of them had ever acknowledged aloud. "Why," Eliza asked, her voice unsteady now, "would you hide something so simple as our true relation? What harm could it possibly have done to tell me the truth of my own mother?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because acknowledging you as my sister's daughter meant acknowledging the claim that came with you. And once Charlotte was born, and I began to see the advantages a strong marriage might bring our family, I could not bear the thought of your claim standing between my own daughter and the kind of match I had always hoped for her. It was easier, I told myself, to keep the truth buried entirely, rather than risk it surfacing at the worst possible moment." Adrian, who had listened to this exchange with careful attention, finally spoke again, his tone gentle but firm. "Mrs. Hart, I understand the fear that drove your decisions, even if I cannot entirely condone the years of concealment that resulted from it. But I must be direct with you both. The claim exists, whether acknowledged or not, and my solicitor believes it carries genuine legal weight, should Miss Hart ever choose to pursue it formally. And if she does, Margaret said, her voice tight with old anxiety, what becomes of Charlotte's own prospects? What becomes of any hope she might have had of a match with your family, your Grace, now that her cousin's claim stands so plainly between them? Adrian's expression grew thoughtful, and he was quiet for a long moment before answering, choosing his words with evident care. I will speak honestly, Mrs. Hart, because I believe honesty is owed to you both after so many years of careful concealment. I never intended to choose a bride from among the families gathered at my ball based on land, or claims, or old agreements. I have spent this past year attending gathering after gathering, hoping to find a woman who might see me as something more than a title to be won, and I confess I had begun to despair of ever finding her among the usual circles of society. His eyes moved to Eliza, steady and unmistakably sincere. I did not pursue this matter of the old claim because I hoped to secure land, or because I felt any obligation toward your daughter's prospects. I pursued it because I could not stop thinking of a woman who scolded me on a country road for riding too fast, who knelt in the dirt to comfort a frightened child while an entire garden party merely watched, and who, I have since learned, has spent her whole life being told she was worth nothing, when in truth she has always been worth a great deal indeed. The study fell into a stunned, heavy silence. Margaret stared at the Duke with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning understanding, while Eliza felt her own heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone in the room must be able to hear it. "Your Grace," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I do not know what to say to such a declaration, offered so plainly and so soon." "You need not say anything at all, not yet," Adrian said gently. "I have no wish to overwhelm you further, particularly not after the shocks you have already endured today. I only wished you to understand my intentions clearly, so that whatever choice you make regarding the old claim, you make it knowing the full truth of my own feelings, rather than suspecting me of some hidden motive." Eliza looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, and thought of everything she had learned in the span of a single afternoon. The truth of her mother's identity, the truth of Margaret's own relation to her, the truth of a claim she had never known she carried, and now, most startling of all, the truth of a duke's genuine regard, offered without pretense or calculation. "I need time," she said finally, looking up to meet Adrian's steady gaze. "Time to understand what has been given to me today, before I can decide what to do with any of it." "Of course," Adrian said immediately. "Take whatever time you require. I will not press you further on the claim or on any other matter until you are ready to speak of it again." Margaret, watching this exchange with an expression Eliza could not entirely read, rose slowly from her chair, the bundle of old letters still clutched in her hands. "Your Grace," she said, her voice unsteady, "whatever comes of this matter, I owe you an apology for the deceptions I have practiced these many years, deceptions that were never truly about protecting Eliza, however much I told myself otherwise. I hope, in time, she can forgive me for them, even if I cannot yet forgive myself." Eliza looked at her aunt for a long moment, seeing not the cold, controlling woman who had ordered her hidden away in an attic, but a frightened, flawed person who had made choices out of fear rather than cruelty, however much damage those choices had caused. "We have a great deal to discuss, Aunt," she said finally, "but I do not think today is the day for it. I would like to go home now and sit with everything I have learned before I decide what forgiveness, if any, I am ready to offer." Adrian walked them to their carriage himself, an unusual courtesy that did not go unnoticed by the household staff watching from the windows of Wardour House. As Eliza climbed into the carriage, he caught her hand briefly, his touch gentle, his eyes searching hers with an earnestness that made her breath catch. "Whatever you decide, Miss Hart," he said quietly, "know that my regard for you does not depend upon any claim or any land or any agreement between our families. It depends only upon the woman I have come to know these past weeks, however briefly our acquaintance has been." Eliza managed only a small, uncertain smile in response, her heart too full of conflicting emotion to find adequate words. The carriage pulled away from Wardour House a moment later, carrying her back toward a home that felt, for the first time in her life, both entirely familiar and utterly transformed by everything she had learned within its walls. Margaret sat silent beside her for most of the journey, staring out at the passing countryside with an expression of quiet, exhausted reflection. It was only as the carriage turned onto the final stretch of road leading toward the Hart estate that she finally spoke again, her voice soft and uncertain in a way Eliza had never heard from her before. "I do not know how to be the aunt you deserved, Eliza, after so many years of failing to be one at all. But I would like, if you will permit me, to try." Eliza turned to look at her aunt, seeing the genuine uncertainty in Margaret's face, the fear of rejection lurking beneath her carefully composed exterior. "I would like that too, Aunt," she said finally. "Though I think it will take both of us some time to learn how." The carriage rolled on through the gathering dusk, carrying two women toward a home neither of them would ever see quite the same way again, while behind them, at Wardour House, a duke stood at his study window long after their departure, watching the road until the last traces of dust from their carriage wheels had settled, already turning over in his mind every possible way he might convince Eliza Hart that the life waiting for her, should she choose to accept it, held far more warmth than the shadows she had spent so long hidden within. Word of Eliza's visit to Wardour House traveled through the county with the particular speed that only genuinely astonishing gossip could achieve. Within days, everyone from the grandest estates to the smallest cottages seemed to know some fragment of the story. A hidden niece, a forgotten claim, a duke's evident interest in a young woman no one had previously known existed. The details grew more elaborate with each retelling, until Eliza scarcely recognized the wild rumors that reached her second hand through Grace's careful reporting. "They're saying you're secretly a lost princess," Grace announced one afternoon, settling into the attic with poorly concealed delight, "hidden away by a wicked aunt who feared you'd outshine her own daughter. Lady Fenwick's cook heard it from a footman who heard it from someone at Wardour House itself, though I can't imagine that part is true." "None of it is entirely true," Eliza said, though she could not help a small smile at the absurdity of it. "Though I suppose the wicked aunt portion is not so far from certain truths, even if my aunt herself is trying now, in her own careful way, to be something better than that." Indeed, in the weeks since their visit to Wardour House, Margaret had changed in ways Eliza still found difficult to fully trust. The sharp, controlling instructions had softened into something closer to genuine conversation. Margaret had begun, haltingly and with evident discomfort, to speak of Eliza's mother more openly than she ever had before, small memories, mostly, fragments of a childhood shared between two sisters who had grown apart long before either of them expected it. Eliza treasured these small offerings, even as she remained cautious about how much of her aunt's newfound warmth to trust after so many years of careful concealment. Charlotte, too, had approached her cousin differently since the truth had come to light, though her own feelings remained more complicated. She had grown up believing herself the center of her mother's careful ambitions, only to discover that a cousin she had barely thought of as family carried a claim that might, had circumstances unfolded differently, have shaped her own future in ways she was only beginning to understand. "I'm not angry with you," Charlotte said one evening, finding Eliza alone in the garden as the last light of day faded toward evening. "Though I confess I do not entirely know what I feel instead. It is strange, learning that the quiet cousin I scarcely thought about at all these many years was, in truth, entitled to something I always believed was simply mine to claim, should the right match present itself." "I never sought to take anything from you, Charlotte," Eliza said quietly. "I did not even know, until a few short weeks ago, that there was anything to take." "I know that," Charlotte said, and something in her voice softened. "I suppose what troubles me most is not the claim itself, but the years my mother spent so carefully arranging my future around a secret she never once thought to share with either of us. I wonder now how much of what I believed about my own prospects was ever truly real, and how much was simply my mother's careful management of a truth she feared." The two cousins sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, watching the last light fade from the sky, and Eliza found herself grateful, unexpectedly, for a conversation she had not known she needed until it happened. Adrian, true to his word, did not press Eliza further in the days that followed their meeting at Wardour House. Instead, he sent occasional letters, thoughtful, unhurried notes that asked after her well-being without demanding any particular response, that shared small observations about his own days without expecting reciprocation. Eliza found herself looking forward to these letters more than she cared to admit, and gradually, her own responses grew longer, more open, more willing to share the genuine thoughts and observations she had spent a lifetime keeping carefully hidden from the world around her. It was nearly a month after their first meeting at Wardour House that Adrian finally requested to call upon her directly, and Eliza, feeling more settled now in the strange new truth of her own identity, agreed readily. He arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon, dressed as simply as he had been on the day of their first encounter on the village road, and Eliza met him in the same garden where Charlotte had found her weeks before, the last golden leaves of the season drifting down around them as they walked slowly along the familiar paths. "I have given considerable thought to the old claim," Eliza said, as they walked, "and I have decided, with my aunt's full agreement, that I do not wish to pursue it formally. Whatever land or rights it might entitle me to, I find I have little interest in disrupting Charlotte's own prospects, or in claiming something my mother herself chose to set aside in favor of a life she found more meaningful." Adrian nodded slowly, though something in his expression suggested he had anticipated this decision. "That is entirely your right to decide, and I will support whatever choice you make regarding it. Though I hope," he added, with the faintest hint of a smile, "that you understand my own regard for you was never contingent upon whether you chose to pursue that claim at all." "I do understand that now," Eliza said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it entirely. "Though I confess I am still learning how to trust that a man of your position might genuinely value a woman for something other than what she might bring to a match." "Then allow me the privilege of proving it to you," Adrian said, "for as long as it takes." They walked together through the garden for the better part of an hour, speaking of matters both significant and trivial, and Eliza found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely at ease in the company of another person, not performing obedience, not managing careful silence, simply being herself, exactly as she was, and finding that self genuinely welcomed rather than concealed. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, Adrian paused beneath the same old oak tree where Charlotte had once found Eliza deep in troubled thought, and turned to face her directly, his expression more serious now than it had been throughout their entire conversation. "Eliza Hart," he said, "I have spent this past month learning everything there is to know about you, and I find that every new discovery only deepens my regard rather than diminishing it. I do not ask this lightly, nor do I ask it because of any old claim or family agreement. I ask it because I have not, in all my years of searching, found another woman who speaks to me with such honesty, or who carries such quiet strength beneath so much undeserved hardship. Would you consider, in time, allowing me to court you properly, without the shadow of hidden secrets or family schemes standing between us?" Eliza felt the weight of the question settle over her, warm and enormous all at once, and found that her answer, when it came, required no hesitation at all. "I would like that very much, Your Grace," she said, and the smile that broke across her face in that moment was unlike any she had allowed herself in years, unguarded, genuine, entirely her own. The courtship that followed was unlike anything the county had witnessed in recent memory, and it did not take long for the whispered rumors that had once painted Eliza as a mysterious lost princess to shift into something far closer to admiration. She was seen now at gatherings she had once only watched from attic windows, walking beside the Duke of Wardour with a quiet confidence that seemed to grow a little stronger with each passing week. Those who had once dismissed her as an unremarkable poor relation found themselves, rather suddenly, eager for her acquaintance, though Eliza met this shifting tide of attention with the same steady honesty that had first caught Adrian's notice on a quiet country road. Margaret, for her part, seemed to find in this new arrangement not the disaster she had once feared, but an unexpected redemption. Rather than resenting the attention now directed toward her niece, she began, with evident and sometimes clumsy effort, to support Eliza in ways she had never once offered before, helping to select fabric for new gowns, offering advice on the particular etiquette of moving within Wardour's social circle, even defending Eliza sharply against the occasional lingering murmur of jealousy from families who had once hoped to secure the Duke for their own daughters. "I cannot undo the years I spent hiding you away," Margaret said one evening, as she helped Eliza fasten the clasps of a new gown ahead of a dinner at Wardour House. "But I can, at least, spend whatever years remain to me making certain the world sees you exactly as clearly as you deserve to be seen." Charlotte, too, had settled into her own quiet peace with the new order of things. She had, in the months since the truth first came to light, formed an unexpected friendship with Nathaniel Cole, Adrian's closest companion, who found in Charlotte's easy warmth a welcome contrast to the careful, calculated conversations he usually endured in society. Whatever disappointment Charlotte might once have felt at losing her mother's singular focus on securing a ducal match for her had faded, replaced by a genuine happiness in watching her cousin find a place in the world that had, for so long, been deliberately denied to her. It was at a dinner held at Wardour House itself, nearly 4 months after that first fateful garden party, that Adrian finally made his intentions known publicly, before an assembled gathering of the county's most prominent families. Many of the very same guests who had once whispered about the mysterious hidden niece of the Hart household, unaware of who she truly was or why she had been so carefully concealed. He rose at the head of the long dining table, and the room fell into an expectant hush, sensing that something significant was about to be announced. "I have spent this past year attending gathering after gathering," Adrian began, his eyes finding Eliza's across the table, "searching for a woman who might see beyond the title I carry to the person beneath it. I confess I had nearly given up hope of finding her, until a chance encounter on a country road introduced me to a young woman whose honesty and quiet strength I have not been able to forget since." A ripple of understanding moved through the gathered guests, many of whom had, by now, heard some version of the remarkable story that had unfolded within their own county over the preceding months. "Eliza Hart," Adrian continued, moving now to stand beside her chair, "you have spent much of your life being told, in ways both large and small, that you did not matter, that your existence was something to be hidden rather than celebrated. I hope in the months and years ahead to spend every day proving to you exactly how wrong that belief always was." He knelt then, before the entire assembled gathering, drawing a small velvet box from his coat pocket. "Would you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" The dining room erupted into a mixture of gasps and delighted murmurs, but Eliza heard none of it clearly, her entire attention fixed on the man kneeling before her, offering not merely a title or a fortune, but the simple, steady regard she had once believed herself entirely unworthy of receiving. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with an emotion too full to properly contain. "Yes, I will." The cheer that rose from the assembled guests was genuine and warm, and Eliza found herself, in the midst of the celebration that followed, catching her aunt's eye across the room. Margaret's face, usually so carefully composed, was openly wet with tears, and she offered her niece a small, trembling smile that carried more honest affection than Eliza had ever seen from her before. The wedding, when it finally took place the following spring, was a grand affair, attended by nearly every prominent family in the county, though Eliza had insisted, against considerable protest from those who wished for a more elaborate ceremony, on keeping the guest list small enough that she might actually know and care for everyone present. Grace stood among the small gathering of household staff invited to witness the ceremony, beaming with the particular pride of someone who had once carried bread and cheese up to a lonely attic, and now watched that same lonely girl walk down the aisle toward a future no one could have predicted only a year before. Mrs. Ellery, too, wept openly through most of the ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and murmuring to anyone nearby about how she had always known There was something special about that quiet, thoughtful girl, hidden away though she had been for so many years. As Eliza walked down the aisle of the small village church, dressed in a gown of pale ivory silk that caught the spring light streaming through the tall windows, she thought back, briefly, to that cold attic room where she had once watched carriages arrive for a ball she was forbidden to attend, wondering what it might feel like to belong somewhere, to be seen by someone, to matter to the world beyond the narrow confines of her aunt's careful concealment. She had her answer now, standing at the end of that long aisle, watching Adrian's face break into a smile of unguarded joy as she approached. A duke who had pulled back every curtain her aunt had so carefully drawn, not out of vanity or entitlement, but out of a genuine desire to see the woman hidden behind them, and to love her, fully and openly, for exactly who she was. The ceremony itself passed in a warm blur of vows and quiet joy, and when Adrian finally slipped a ring onto her finger, sealing a promise that neither of them intended to break, Eliza felt, for the first time in her entire life, the full and complete certainty of belonging somewhere to someone without condition or concealment. Outside the church, as the newly married couple emerged into the bright spring sunshine to the cheers of the gathered crowd, Margaret stood near the front, her hand tightly clasped in Charlotte's, both of them smiling through happy tears. Nathaniel stood close beside Charlotte, his own affection for her now an open and welcome secret among their small circle of friends, and Grace and Mrs. Ellery clapped and cheered along with everyone else, delighted beyond words to witness the happy ending of a story they had, in their own small ways, helped carry forward. Eliza paused for a moment at the church steps, turning back to look at the small crowd gathered to celebrate her, a crowd that would have been unthinkable only a year before, when her very existence had been treated as a secret too dangerous to acknowledge. She thought of the frightened, hidden girl she had once been, watching the world through a narrow attic window, and felt a quiet, profound gratitude for every difficult step that had led her, eventually, to this bright spring morning. Adrian took her hand as they descended the church steps together, and Eliza felt, walking beside him into the warm sunlight, that whatever curtain had once been drawn across her life had been pulled back for good, leaving nothing hidden, nothing concealed, only the clear, open truth of a woman finally free to be exactly who she had always been. A year passed at Wardour House, and the quiet attic room that had once defined so much of Eliza's early life became, in her mind, a distant memory rather than a lingering wound. She had settled into her new role with the same steady thoughtfulness that had first drawn Adrian's attention, earning the genuine respect of the household staff and the surrounding community alike, not through the authority of her title, but through the simple, consistent kindness she extended to everyone she encountered, regardless of their station. She made a point in those early months of visiting the old locked room at the Hart estate one final time, now with her aunt's full blessing rather than in secret. Together, she and Margaret carefully restored her mother's portrait to a place of honor, hanging it not in some forgotten corner but in the main hallway of the Hart household, where it could be seen and remembered by everyone who passed. Margaret spoke more freely now of her sister, sharing stories Eliza had never heard before, small details that helped fill in the outline of a woman Eliza had spent so many years knowing only as an absence. Charlotte's own happiness, too, continued to bloom in the months that followed. Her friendship with Nathaniel deepened steadily into something more, and when he finally requested her hand the following autumn, Charlotte accepted with a joy that seemed, to everyone who knew her, entirely genuine and well-earned. The two cousins, once separated by careful deception and unequal treatment, found themselves instead standing together as sisters in every way that truly mattered, supporting each other through the ordinary joys and difficulties of their new lives. Grace, ever loyal, was brought into Eliza's household at Wardour House by Eliza's own particular request, given a position of far greater trust and responsibility than she had ever held in the Hart household, and she settled into her new role with obvious delight, often reminding anyone who would listen that she had always known there was something special about the quiet girl in the attic, long before the rest of the county caught on. Mrs. Ellery remained at the Hart estate, continuing to manage the household with the same steady competence she always had, though she visited Wardour House often enough that the staff there had come to regard her almost as one of their own. She never tired of telling the story to any new servant who joined the household, of the night a duke's eyes first found a single candle burning in a distant attic window, unaware that the small, flickering light would one day lead him to the woman who would become his wife. Eliza and Adrian's own life together settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected but both found deeply satisfying. Adrian, who had spent so many years feeling like nothing more than a title to be pursued, found in Eliza a partner who challenged him, questioned him, and loved him with the same honest directness she had shown him on that first country road, unchanged by wealth or status or the endless demands of society. Eliza, in turn, found in Adrian not merely a husband who had rescued her from obscurity, but a genuine equal, someone who valued her opinions on matters both great and small, who listened when she spoke and considered her thoughts worth acting upon. They spent long evenings together in the study where they had first properly spoken of the old family claim, discussing everything from estate matters to their hopes for the family they intended, in time, to build together. Eliza never did pursue the old claim to the northern lands, content to let that particular piece of the past remain settled, but she found, in its place, something far more valuable than land or legal right, a genuine, secure place in a family and a life that had once seemed entirely closed to her. Word of their story continued to circulate through the county for years afterward, softened and shaped by countless retellings into something closer to legend than history, though those who had lived through it firsthand remembered the truth clearly enough. They remembered a frightened girl hidden away in an attic, forbidden even to be seen. They remembered a duke who refused to accept the easy, comfortable ignorance offered to him by society, choosing instead to pull back every curtain until he found the truth hidden behind it. And they remembered, most of all, a young woman who had spent so long being told she did not matter, finding at last the strength and the support to claim, fully and without apology, exactly who she had always been. On quiet evenings, when the business of the estate had settled and the house grew still around them, Eliza would sometimes find herself standing at the tall windows of Wardour House, looking out over the grounds bathed in soft evening light, remembering the small, cold attic room where this entire story had begun. She no longer felt the old ache of that memory, the fear and loneliness that had once defined so much of her existence. Instead, she felt only a quiet, steady gratitude for every difficult step of the journey that had led her here, to a life built not on concealment, but on the simple, unshakable truth of being fully known and fully loved, exactly as she was. Adrian would often join her at those windows, slipping an arm around her waist and following her gaze out toward the darkening grounds, and neither of them needed many words to share the quiet understanding that passed between them in those moments. They had built something rare together, forged from honesty rather than convenience, chosen freely rather than arranged out of calculation, and both of them understood, without ever needing to say it aloud, exactly how precious that rarity truly was. And so the story of Eliza Hart, once hidden away by her own aunt's fearful hand, came at last to its rightful close, not in the shadow of concealment where it began, but in the full, warm light of a life finally, completely her own.